In a small-town diner, the atmosphere was calm and unassuming, the kind of place where people came to enjoy a cup of coffee, exchange pleasantries, and take refuge from the rush of everyday life. The clinking of silverware and the hum of casual conversations filled the room, creating a setting of normalcy and comfort. Among the patrons was an elderly man, 81 years old, who sat quietly at a corner table. He was a veteran, a man who had once worn the uniform of his country, faced hardships that most could not imagine, and carried within him the quiet dignity of service and sacrifice. To many, he would have seemed like just another old man enjoying his morning meal, but his story was one of courage and endurance that demanded respect. That morning, however, respect was the last thing he was about to receive. Without warning, a thug walked into the diner and approached the veteran. What followed was shocking and deeply unsettling. With no apparent reason, the thug struck him, delivering a slap that echoed through the quiet room and sent a wave of disbelief across the faces of everyone present. It was not just an act of physical aggression, but an insult, a cruel display of arrogance and disregard for the man's age, history, and humanity. The veteran, caught off guard, did not respond with anger or violence. He remained still, his eyes carrying the weight of a life lived through battles far greater than the one he now faced. But the incident created a tension that was almost tangible, and for a brief moment, it felt as though time had frozen inside that diner. The thug stood there with misplaced confidence, believing that he had asserted dominance over someone weaker, someone defenseless. What he failed to realize was that the story was far from over. Fate had aligned events in a way that would soon turn the situation upside down. Just as the silence and unease filled the air, the door of the diner swung open. In stepped the veteran's son, a man whose presence alone commanded attention. He was not alone, and with him came the unmistakable energy of brotherhood and loyalty, carried by the group that followed, the Hells Angels. Their entrance shifted the entire atmosphere of the diner. The thug, who just moments earlier carried himself with arrogance, suddenly found himself face to face with a force he could never have anticipated. What had begun as an act of cruelty against an old man was about to transform into a moment of reckoning. The irony was almost poetic, for the attacker had chosen a victim he thought was alone and powerless, but in truth, that veteran was anything but defenseless. His life, his honor, and his dignity were guarded by something stronger than fists. It was guarded by the love of his son and the solidarity of men who lived by loyalty and respect. What happened next would remind everyone in that diner that actions have consequences and that honor will always stand taller than cowardice. The diner was a simple place, the kind that people drove past every day without giving much thought, yet inside it carried a warmth and familiarity that comforted those who came to sit within its walls. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of eggs, bacon, and toast that drifted from the kitchen. The light chatter of patrons, the scraping of forks on plates, and the occasional ringing of the cash register created a gentle background rhythm that spoke of routine and peace. At one of the corner tables sat an elderly man, 81 years of age, who had lived through more trials than most could imagine. He was a veteran, someone who had borne witness to the horrors of war, who had carried the weight of responsibility, and who had once stood in defense of his country during times of chaos and fear. His frame was smaller now, worn down by years, his hair silver, his movements slower than they had once been, but his spirit was unbroken. Though age had changed his appearance, it could not erase the pride and dignity that clung to him like a second skin. He was a man who had earned respect through service and sacrifice, yet on this particular day, respect was the very thing denied to him. The morning unfolded much like any other. The veteran sat quietly with his cup of coffee, occasionally lifting his gaze to glance out the window at the small-town streets that seemed to move at a leisurely pace. His thoughts drifted between memories of the past and the simple pleasure of the moment. People greeted one another as they walked in, waitresses moved about with practiced ease, and life seemed calm, ordinary, and steady. It was within this environment of peace that the unexpected storm arrived. A man walked into the diner who carried himself not with humility or kindness, but with an air of aggression and arrogance. He was a thug in every sense of the word, someone who thrived on intimidation, someone who mistook cruelty for strength. His eyes scanned the room not with curiosity, but with the hunger of a predator, seeking someone weaker, someone who could be humiliated without consequence. His gaze landed on the veteran sitting quietly in the corner. Perhaps it was the man's age, his frailty, or the assumption that he would not fight back that drew the thug toward him. Whatever the reason, the choice was deliberate. The aggressor approached the table, and before anyone could understand his intentions, he did something that would shock every soul in that diner. He raised his hand and struck the veteran across the face with a sharp slap. The sound cut through the hum of conversations like a thunderclap, echoing against the walls and forcing every eye in the room to turn toward the scene unfolding before them. Gasps filled the air, coffee cups were set down abruptly, and the once calm diner became charged with disbelief. The veteran's head tilted slightly from the force, but he did not rise, nor did he retaliate. His hands remained on the table, his eyes steady, carrying a depth that spoke of battles long past, battles far greater than the petty cruelty of the man standing before him. There was no fear in his expression, only the quiet endurance of someone who had faced death and destruction and knew the measure of true danger. In that silence, his dignity stood in stark contrast to the cowardice of the thug. The room, however, was not silent. Murmurs broke out among the patrons, whispers of outrage, confusion, and disbelief. Some people froze, unsure of whether to intervene, while others gripped their phones, debating whether to call the authorities. A few stared in horror, unable to process the audacity of a man striking someone so old, someone who should have been shown nothing but respect. The thug smirked, satisfied with his act as though he had proven something, as though by humiliating an elderly man he had demonstrated strength. But in reality, his actions revealed only weakness, the kind of weakness that hides behind cruelty because it cannot stand on its own. His chest puffed slightly, his eyes darting to the onlookers as though waiting for their acknowledgement of his power. Yet what he received instead was a collective sense of disgust. People looked at him not with admiration but with contempt, and in that moment, he became smaller than the man he had tried to diminish. The veteran sat in silence, his composure unshaken. His life had taught him patience, restraint, and the futility of meeting senseless cruelty with immediate anger. In his youth, he had likely faced moments where survival depended not on impulsive reaction, but on calm calculation, and that discipline remained with him even now. He did not give the thug the satisfaction of a reaction. His silence spoke louder than words, and it carried a weight the attacker could never comprehend. Still, the tension was undeniable. The room felt suspended, the air heavy with the expectation of what might come next. Some of the patrons shifted in their seats, their instinct pulling them to stand up for the veteran, yet hesitation held them back. The thug's unpredictability created fear, and fear often shackles the desire to act. The veteran, however, seemed immune to that fear. His stillness was not surrender, but a quiet defiance, a refusal to let a meaningless act of aggression disturb the peace within him. For the thug, this silence was infuriating. He had expected outrage, perhaps a cry for help, or at the very least a display of fear. Instead, he was met with dignity and composure. He had chosen his target believing he would dominate the encounter, but instead he found himself standing in front of a man whose presence, even in silence, overshadowed his own. The old man's history, though invisible to the eyes of the aggressor, carried more strength than the slap could ever diminish. The bystanders, though initially frozen, began to feel the stirrings of something else. Anger simmered beneath the surface, not directed at the veteran for his stillness, but at the thug for his audacity. This was not just an attack on one man, it was an insult to the values of respect, honor, and decency that society held dear. To strike a man of advanced years, especially one who had sacrificed for his country, was to trample upon the very fabric of community and morality. The silence of the veteran became a mirror reflecting the ugliness of the thug's act, and the contrast grew more unbearable by the second. In that diner, time seemed to stretch, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. The thug, standing tall in his own mind, had created a scene that would not be easily forgotten. He believed himself the victor, yet he was unaware that the true story had only just begun, that his actions had set in motion events that would soon unravel his false sense of power. What he thought was dominance was in fact the beginning of his downfall. The moment after the slap lingered in the air like a shadow that refused to move, stretching across the diner and leaving every patron caught between shock and silence. The old man had not raised his hand, had not shouted or demanded anything, and that quiet endurance seemed almost to unsettle the very walls of the place. The thug stood with a twisted grin, mistaking the silence as victory, mistaking the restraint of the veteran for weakness, when in truth it was the strength of a man who had seen more than this petty cruelty could ever amount to. The other customers exchanged glances, torn between outrage and fear, wanting to stand but frozen in the weight of uncertainty. It felt like a standoff, a strange pause before something inevitable, as though the very air itself waited to be broken. And then it was. The door of the diner swung open with the sound of the little bell above it ringing sharply, slicing through the heavy silence and pulling every head toward the entrance. There, stepping inside with the kind of presence that needed no announcement, was the veteran's son. He was not merely a man walking into a diner. He was a force entering the room, carrying with him an aura that made the thug's smirk falter even before words were spoken. His shoulders were broad, his expression sharp, and his eyes immediately found his father seated in the corner. He saw the red mark still fresh on his father's cheek, and in that instant, something inside him shifted from calm recognition to burning fury. But this fury was not wild or uncontrolled. It was the kind of fury that belonged to men who knew exactly how to channel it, men who understood strength not as recklessness, but as power ready to be unleashed with precision. Behind him, the sound of heavy boots and the subtle clink of chains followed. They were not random men walking in by chance. They were the unmistakable presence of the Hell's Angels, a brotherhood bound not only by the roar of motorcycles and the ink of tattoos, but by loyalty, honor, and the unspoken code of standing together. They filled the doorway and spilled into the diner, their leather vests catching the light, their expressions unreadable but intense, carrying with them the weight of reputation that stretched across cities and decades. For anyone who knew their name, it was enough to make the heart beat faster, and for the thug who had raised his hand against the veteran, it was enough to drain the color from his face. The atmosphere inside the diner transformed in an instant. Where moments ago there had been tension born of uncertainty, now there was a shift into something sharper, heavier, something that pressed down on the thug with the realization of what he had done and who he had done it to. The veteran's son moved forward with measured steps, each one deliberate, each one pulling the room tighter into his orbit. His gaze never left the man who had struck his father, and though he said nothing yet, his silence spoke of storms brewing beneath the surface. The thug, who had moments earlier believed himself dominant, felt his confidence begin to unravel. The smirk that had clung to his lips disappeared, replaced by the first flicker of doubt. He glanced around, seeking an exit, but every path seemed blocked, not by walls, but by the sheer presence of the bikers who had entered behind the son. They spread through the diner in quiet formation, not loud, not rowdy, but with a kind of disciplined menace that only those who truly understood loyalty could project. The customers who had once sat frozen now looked on with a mixture of awe and relief. What had felt like injustice without resolution was suddenly tilting toward a reckoning, and it was as though everyone could feel it in their bones. The veteran himself looked up at his son, their eyes meeting for a brief moment, and in that look passed 1,000 unspoken words. Gratitude, pride, sorrow that such a moment had even come to pass, and reassurance that the old man was still steady even after what had happened. The son gave a slight nod, a silent promise that what had been done would not be left unanswered. He then turned his full attention to the thug, who now looked smaller than he had only moments before, shrinking under the weight of what he had provoked. The Hell's Angels who stood in the room were not merely present as spectators. They were a living wall behind the sun, a testament to brotherhood, and their very presence magnified the weight of the moment. Each man carried with him a history, a reputation, and an unshakable code, and though none of them had raised their voices, their silence spoke volumes. The thug was not facing one man's anger. He was facing the fury of loyalty multiplied, the kind of loyalty that does not waver and does not forgive disrespect lightly. Every second stretched longer than the last. The clinking of a spoon dropped somewhere in the diner sounded like thunder in the silence, and the thug flinched at even that small sound. He had expected to strike an old man and walk away with a sense of power, but now he stood at the center of a circle he could not escape. His earlier arrogance crumbled with every heartbeat, and the reality of his situation pressed down like iron. His breathing quickened, his posture shifted, and the weight of regret began to show on his face. He had chosen the wrong man, at the wrong time, and now the consequences stood before him in the form of a son and a brotherhood who lived by a creed that placed loyalty and respect above all else. The son finally stepped closer, his voice breaking the silence for the first time, low and steady. A voice that carried not only anger but command. His words were few, but they were heavy, each one landing like a blow sharper than any fist. He did not shout, he did not need to. His very presence carried authority, and the thug knew that he was no longer in control of anything, not even his own fear. The diner's patrons leaned forward, their eyes locked on the unfolding scene, knowing they were witnessing not just confrontation, but justice finding its path. The thug opened his mouth, perhaps to stammer an excuse or plea, but the son's gaze silenced him before words could form. There was no room for justification, no possibility of escape through lies. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and damning. He had struck a man who represented not just age but sacrifice, not just fragility but honor, and he had done so thinking there would be no cost. Now, standing under the weight of eyes filled with loyalty and love, he realized the price he would pay. The biker brotherhood behind the sun did not move, did not speak, but the tension in their stillness carried the promise of action should it be required. They were there not to intimidate for the sake of fear, but to stand for something far larger than themselves. They were there for the veteran, for the son, for the principle that respect is not optional, and that to strike a man who has given his life to his country is to invite consequences far greater than one could imagine. Their leather vests bore symbols that the thug surely recognized, symbols that told him he was no longer the predator but the prey, caught in a net woven of loyalty, strength, and unshakable resolve. The son's presence alone was enough to make the thug shrink, but combined with the brotherhood at his back, it was overwhelming. The diner, once a place of quiet meals and conversation, had transformed into a stage where cowardice was exposed, and honor stood ready to reclaim its ground. The air felt thick, alive with energy, and every person inside knew they were witnessing the moment a bully was stripped of his false power. The thug shifted on his feet, his eyes darting nervously as though searching for an escape that did not exist. The weight of his own actions pressed on him harder with each passing moment, and for the first time, he realized that the man he had struck was never alone, had never been powerless, because behind him stood love, loyalty, and strength that could not be shaken. The diner had become a stage where silence itself carried the weight of judgment. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, as the thug stood trembling under the gaze of the veterans, son, and the silent wall of Hell's Angels behind him. Moments earlier he had believed himself the strongest man in the room, but now his arrogance had collapsed into visible fear. His breathing was shallow, his hands shook ever so slightly, and his eyes darted from the veteran to his son to the men surrounding him, as though hoping for some exit, some chance to undo what he had done. Yet there was no escape, no way to erase the moment. He had crossed a line, one that could not be stepped back over, and now every soul in the diner watched, waiting for justice to reveal itself. The veteran sat still, his composure unchanged, his face calm despite the red mark that still lingered on his cheek. To him, the slap was not the first act of cruelty he had endured in his life, and it would not be the last indignity he was capable of surviving. He had faced the terrors of battlefields in his youth, watched comrades fall, and carried scars no one could see. But what mattered now was not his own endurance. What mattered was that his son stood before him, defending not just his honor but the principle that no man deserved to be humiliated, least of all one who had already given so much for his country. Their eyes met again, and for a fleeting second, the old man's steady look seemed to calm his son's fury, grounding it not in reckless violence but in a deeper purpose. The son stepped closer to the thug, his presence towering over him, and when he spoke, his words were low, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. He told him that a man's worth is measured not by how he treats those stronger than himself, but by how he treats those he perceives as weaker. He reminded him that respect is not a choice, not a luxury, but a duty, especially toward elders and those who had sacrificed for the freedoms he now carelessly enjoyed. Each word struck the thug harder than the slap he had given, breaking through the thin armor of bravado he had tried to wear. The son did not raise his voice, did not need to, because the weight of truth carried its own thunder. The thug attempted to stammer something in return, perhaps an excuse or an apology, but his words faltered, clumsy and hollow. The customers who had been silent observers now shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement with the son's words, others murmuring softly among themselves, their sympathy with the veteran and their contempt directed wholly at the aggressor. The diner, once frozen in fear, now breathed again, and its breath carried with it the collective will of people who knew right from wrong. The Hell's Angels remained still, yet their silence was not empty. It was the silence of men who had no need to posture, who carried with them the certainty of action should it be required. Their presence alone spoke volumes, a promise that the old man would never again stand alone in the face of cruelty. For the thug, this was more than intimidation. It was a reminder that loyalty and honor forge bonds stronger than any act of violence could break. He had walked into the diner believing himself powerful, but power had shifted, revealing itself in the unity of a son defending his father and a brotherhood standing guard over respect itself. The son's words continued, not for his own satisfaction, but for the lesson that needed to be carved into the heart of the coward before him. He spoke of dignity, of the price men pay when they live without it, and of the truth that cruelty is the refuge of the weak, not the strength of the powerful. Each sentence peeled away the thug's defenses until nothing remained but the raw, exposed shame of a man who had humiliated himself far more than he had ever humiliated his victim. The crowd in the diner listened, transfixed, their hearts swelling with a sense of justice restored not through wild revenge, but through the steady, unyielding assertion of principle. The thug's shoulders slumped. His earlier swagger had vanished entirely. The smirk that once clung to his lips was gone, replaced by the grimace of a man who knew he had miscalculated everything. The son stood only inches from him now, his eyes sharp, his presence unrelenting, and behind him the bikers stood like a fortress that no arrogance could penetrate. The veteran, sitting quietly, became the eye of the storm, the reason for it all, and yet the calmest figure in the room. His silence had been transformed into a symbol, a reminder that dignity often speaks louder than retaliation. At last, the thug muttered an apology, his voice barely audible, his tone unconvincing. It was not the apology of true remorse, but the plea of a man desperate to escape the consequences of his actions. The son leaned in, his voice low enough for only the thug to hear, but the firmness of his tone carried across the room. He told him that respect could not be begged in moments of fear, it had to be earned in a lifetime of action. He told him that an apology meant nothing when it came only from the shadow of consequences. The words cut deep, leaving the thug with no place to hide. The son then stepped back, his eyes still fixed on the thug, and with a single motion of his head, signaled that the man was no longer welcome. The thug hesitated, but the glint in the eyes of the bikers surrounding him left no room for delay. He turned and shuffled toward the door, his movements awkward, his once loud presence reduced to a pitiful retreat. The sound of the bell above the diner door echoed as he stumbled out, a sound that marked the end of his false reign of power. Inside the diner, the atmosphere shifted once more. What had been fear and tension only moments ago now dissolved into relief, respect, and even admiration. The patrons clapped softly at first, then more firmly, the sound filling the room as a tribute not only to the veteran, but to the courage and loyalty that had defended him. The son placed a hand gently on his father's shoulder, a gesture of love and reassurance, while the bikers stood watch like guardians, ensuring that the dignity of the old man remained untouched. The veteran finally spoke, his voice calm, steady, and filled with wisdom that comes only from a long life lived with principle. He told his son that anger must always be guided by purpose, that strength without restraint is no strength at all, and that the true measure of a man lies not in how fiercely he can fight, but in how deeply he can honor what is right. His words settled over the room, reminding everyone that this was not simply about a slap or a confrontation, but about the deeper values that hold communities together. The son nodded, understanding, and the bikers stood silently in respect for the old man's wisdom. The customers in the diner, some with tears in their eyes, felt as though they had witnessed not just a confrontation but a lesson, one that reminded them of the power of loyalty, the importance of respect, and the truth that justice does not always come through fists, but through presence, solidarity, and unshakable dignity. The diner slowly returned to its rhythm. Coffee cups lifted again, conversations resumed, and plates were once more filled. But something had changed, something that lingered long after the moment had passed. The people who had been there would tell the story again and again, not simply of a thug who slapped an old man, but of the son who walked in with the Hells Angels and restored honor to his father. It became more than an incident. It became a tale of respect reclaimed, of cowardice exposed, and of love that stood unyielding in the face of cruelty. For the veteran, the slap was already fading into memory, but the presence of his son and the Brotherhood behind him was what remained, stronger than the act of aggression that had begun it all. He sat with quiet pride, knowing that though his body was frail, his life was still surrounded by strength, not the strength of violence but the strength of loyalty, love, and the values he had lived by his entire life. And so the story closed, not with revenge but with resolution, not with destruction but with dignity. The thug was gone, stripped of the power he thought he had, and the veteran remained, untouched in spirit, his honor reaffirmed before the eyes of all who had witnessed it. The diner, once again just a small place where people came for food and company, carried within it the memory of a day when respect was defended, loyalty stood tall, and an old man was shown that even in his twilight years, he was never alone.